So this is about as good as it gets for a person like me. So if you're a research scientist, the opportunity to be able to come to the National Science Foundation and talk about our science it's about as good as it gets, and a full room. So we're very excited to be here, and I would really like to thank Dave and the other members, and John and the other members of the LTER working group for organizing this symposium, and for Cheryl for filling the seats, and so we're very excited to be here. The LTER network was founded in 1981, and since that time, we have been, lots of investigators have been involved, doing lots of research. We've produced lots of publicly available data and lots of good science. Now, if you look at the distribution of these sites, you'll see this is not a geographically systematic distribution of LTER sites. LTER projects are competitively awarded to groups of investigators that are able to articulate compelling questions that require long-term data to collect. I guess so it's 28 sites, and we're particularly excited to welcome 3 new sites to the network just in the last year. Very consistent with our theme today of ocean connections. So 2 in Alaska, 1 in the Gulf of Maine. So 28 sites with a scientific distribution, not so much a geographic distribution. LTER research is centered on long-term observations. So when we fund an LTER site, we have a group of investigators that have articulated compelling scientific questions that can only be addressed by the collection of long-term data. And in cycles of LTER research, we address those questions. New questions emerge from the long-term data, and new questions emerge that, again, can only be addressed with long-term data. So long-term observations are at the center of all LTER research. There's also a lot of experiments in the LTER network. We use experiments to understand the mechanisms behind the long-term dynamics of the system, and we use experiments to be able to produce a quantitative and predictive understanding of how these systems are behaving in time and space. So LTER is a very powerful platform for unique and compelling research. It's also a platform for a powerful platform for the flow of information from science to society. So if you are in a place for a long period of time, it allows you to develop relationships with stakeholders. So LTER sites have well-developed relationships with environmental managers and educators and landowners at sites across the country. It's also an important platform for the development of multidisciplinary research. Again, if I'm in a place for a long period of time, we can build the relationships across disciplines, which, as Joanne said, are so fundamental for progress in modern environmental science research. We like to think that we use the LTER platform to address the hardest, most important, and most novel questions in environmental science. Ecosystems around the world are changing in complex ways. We need to be able to characterize the nature and extent of that change, but more fundamentally, we need to be able to understand the mechanisms underlying that change and to develop a quantitative and predictive understanding of the nature and extent of that change. And that's the LTER mission. The National Science Foundation also funds a network communications office, and the leaders of that, so it's Frank Davis and Marty Downs are here, and if you could stand up and say hi, they're the leaders of our office. The primary goal of the network communications office is synthesis, and so it's quite interesting that the network office is based at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and their expertise and experience has made fundamental contributions over the last 3 years towards bringing together, these are competitively funded synthesis groups to bring together data from within the LTER network, to bring in data from outside the LTER network to address synthesis of long-term data. The network office also facilitates education and training both within the network and between the network and the rest of the world. And there's a communications and outreach component where the network office presents a clear and coherent face of the LTER network to NSF and to the outside world. Network office is very important for us. So it's a great honor and privilege to be able to work at an LTER site. And the question that we always ask ourselves, and the question that we are asking you today, is are we addressing the hardest, most important, and most novel questions in environmental science? And as I said before, ecosystems around the world are changing in complex ways. And we need to characterize the nature and extent of that change. But the more fundamental challenge is to understand the mechanisms underlying that change and to develop a quantitative and predictive understanding of that change. I think the talks we're going to see today are going to illustrate this really, really well. So ecosystems at the margins or at the interface between the land and the sea are changing in dynamic and important ways. And so we're going to see a series of talks. So marshes, reefs, kelp forests, these are ecosystems that are complex and are changing in complex ways. And in the talks today, we're going to see that fundamental ecological interactions are at the center of the nature of that change and the mechanism of that change. And I think we're going to see a series of very compelling talks that are going to illustrate the way LTER works and that we're doing really fundamental basic research in an important context of environmental change. And so that's all I wanted to say.